you had parents, once he signed the executive order, parents sued. They argued that the order violated the 14th Amendment and it also violated the Immigration and Nationality Act. So the district court agreed, uh, and it was a certified nationwide class action because they wanted to be able to block every other district court from being able to every other agency. They wanted it worldwide, so that's why they did it. And the Supreme Court said, "Okay, you know what? We're not going to even let you appeal this to the appellate court." In which it would have went to the First Circuit. It said, "Nah, we got this." So they reached down with like an eagle's claw. Okay, like they came down like this and said, "No, appellate court, we got this." Okay, and so that's unheard of. The fact that they bypassed the First Circuit and took it straight to the Supreme Court because it was such a serious constitutional issue, and they didn't want the First Circuit to mess that up. And the question presented was very direct. Does the 14th Amendment guarantee citizenship to children born in the United States when their parents are here illegally or temporarily? And the whole fight came down to the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, Trump's position was that these children weren't fully subject to the American jurisdiction because their parents weren't even supposed to be here. And they were subject, and their allegiances were to some other country. The parents' position, the plaintiffs in the case, was that if a child is born in America on America's soil and is subject to American law, then that child is a citizen, except for some narrow historical exceptions, like children born to diplomats or children born during a hostile occupation. And that's an interesting case. So there was a time when Maine wasn't part of America, and there were, I think the British had taken it over. So the children who were born during that time period in Maine weren't considered American citizens. It got real weird because what you all don't know is like the 13 colonies. Yeah, they say they were 13 colonies, but they didn't really get along. They were giving each other all kinds of hard times just because some might be Protestant, some might be a different version of Christianity. It wasn't all hunky dory back then. But bottom line is that's why they said hostile occupation. Okay, is also a reason that the child is not a American citizen. But the Supreme Court sided with the parents, as you all know, and held that the executive order could not strip children of citizenship. But to understand why Trump signed it on day one, you got to remember where we were in this country at that time. You remember 2021 and 2024? Somebody typed Joe Biden and the Sleepy Joe in the chat room. You remember that? The Border Patrol, running up, they call them encounters. Okay, the Border Patrol encounters at the Southwest. In other words, the Border Patrol, look, more than 1.5 million in 2024, 2 million in 2023. Okay, these are the people that they did see. 2.2 million in 2022. I just want you to think about that. That's almost 6 million people just running up the board. These are the ones they did see, not all the ones that they didn't see. And Americans we weren't just watching numbers on spreadsheets, were we? We weren't. We were watching cities overwhelmed with shelters, packed public resources, strained. The federal government looking like it had lost control of the country. And then came the cases that burned into the public, like Laken Riley, the Georgia nursing student who was murdered while jogging. You remember that? Her killers entered the country illegally. And then there was Jocelyn Ngangri. I want to make sure I pronounce this lady's name right. Ngangari. This is a baby. This is a 12-year-old child. And the cold thing about it, it happened not but a few miles past my office. You understand that? That was the baby. These people kidnapped this child and they sexually assaulted this 12-year-old baby, and they strangled. And she was strangled by two Venezuelan men accused of entering the United States illegally. And see, that's the atmosphere this order came out of. Americans were angry. Weren't we angry? Americans were afraid for our children, ourselves. And I'm not even talking about the drunk driving and all that other stuff going on. We felt betrayed by our president at the time, Joe Biden, based on his border patrol. Somebody type border czar in the chat room. Somebody type border czar and his border czar. And so by 2024, immigration wasn't some background issue. It was one of the major reasons Americans voted for Trump, because we wanted it to end. So when Trump came in and said, we're not going to let people walk into this country, drop a baby off, and then automatically create American citizens. And a lot of Americans didn't see that as extreme, did we? We saw that as the government finally doing something, after we had been screaming about it for 4 years. Now, so that's the environment that we're dealing with. Now, Chief Justice Roberts, he wrote the majority opinion, and he didn't treat this like a narrow immigration dispute. He treated it like a citizenship case. And the court began with the executive order itself, which tried to deny the two categories of children born on American soil. And I went over that already, but basically, again, as I said, the district court certified it, this nationwide class action. The government tried to appeal it to the First Circuit, and the Supreme Court stepped in and said, "Nah, we're gonna take this one." And so the question is whether the meaning of American citizenship could be changed by executive power. Can the president do that? Or whether the 14th Amendment is locked in a birthright rule that couldn't be touched by the president. And the majority's rationale starts with, and I mentioned this, it starts with something called just sol. And it's probably pronounced just soleil, but I know it's Latin, so I'm not gonna mess with the word so much, but it's called the doctrine of just sol. And what this means is, meaning citizenship by soil. That's what it means, okay? The doctrine of just sol, all right? I'm gonna put this in here because I want you all to look it up, and you can look at the history and where it came from. It has its origins in old common law. As a matter of fact, Justice Roberts, he leaned heavily into the old common law rule that a child born within the sovereign's dominion, in other words, the king's dominion, owed allegiance to that king or queen at the time, because the sovereign owed protection to that child. Okay. And under that rule, it didn't matter whether the parents were permanent residents, temporary visitors, whether they were foreigners or even subject to expulsion. If the child was born within the sovereign's territory, that child was a natural born subject of the king. And the exceptions were very narrow. Children of foreign ministers, children born in territory controlled by enemy forces, children born outside the sovereign's actual control. And Justice Roberts' points was that, his point was that this broad birth on soil rule crossed the Atlantic and became part of American law, with subjects becoming citizens after the Revolution. And that's where the majority planted its flag. American citizenship, in its view, wasn't built primarily on bloodline. Somebody type bloodline in the chat room. Okay, it wasn't built on bloodline, wasn't built on who your parents were or what their status was, or where you live. It was built on birth within American territory plus being subject to American law.